Welcome to Sports Trades. My name is Lou, and today we're doing the 1986 Mets, where they all went. Basically diagramming every single player, whether they were waived, traded, retired, anything that happened with them and related to them in their tree, I'm going to diagram. So grab some popcorn and enjoy. The 1986 Mets would win 108 games that season. And sadly for Mets fans, it would be the last time that they would see their team win a World Series. And I know the team's not doing all that great this season, so hopefully you can enjoy some nostalgia for 15-20 minutes. And if you're a Mets fan, baseball fan, or sports fan in general, if you happen to like the details that I put in this video, if you learned anything new, if you like this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you have any new ideas for a team you want me to diagram, just put it in the comment section down below. I basically read everything. Randy Neiman would be granted free agency on November 12, 1986. He would later sign with the Minnesota Twins, but was not a part of the 1987 World Series championship team. He would later go on to work with the organization of the Mets for 2 decades, left in 2012 to go with Bobby Valentine to the Boston Red Sox, and in 2013 became the pitching coach for the Palm Beach Cardinals of the St. Louis organization. Danny Heap would be granted free agency on the same day and signed with the Los Angeles Dodgers and would end up winning the 1988 World Series over the Oakland Athletics. He would later go on to coach the Incarnate Word for 20 seasons and coached 6 players that would later go on to be drafted by the MLB. Kevin Mitchell was dealt to the San Diego Padres on December 11, 1986 in exchange for Kevin McReynolds, Gene Walter, and Adam Ging, who stopped playing in 1988, never made it further than A-level ball. On 7/11/1988, the Mets would deal Gene Walter in exchange for Ed Nunez, who would later be released the next season. While Gene Walter was on the Seattle Mariners, he recorded an MLB record 4 balks in 1 single game. On December 11, 1991, the Mets dealt Kevin McReynolds to the Kansas City Royals in exchange for Bill Pecota and 2-time Cy Young Award winner, 1989 Gold Glove, MLB wins leader, American League ERA leader, and 1985 World Series MVP Brett Saberhagen. On the 1995 trading deadline, the New York Mets would deal Brett Saberhagen to the Colorado Rockies in exchange for Juan Acevedo and Arnie Gooch. On March 28, 1998, Juan Acevedo would be dealt to the Cardinals in exchange for Rigo Beltran. On December 1, 1998, the Mets would deal Arnie Gooch to the Dodgers in exchange for Roger Cedeno and Charles Johnson. Later on in the day, Charles Johnson would be dealt to the Baltimore Orioles in exchange for Armando Benitez. On July 16, 2003, Benitez would be dealt to the Yankees in exchange for Jason Anderson, who would be waived and will go on to the Indians the next season. Ryan Bacodoa, I don't know what happened to him. I tried doing the research, couldn't find anything. And Anderson Garcia, who would be lost to the waivers to the Baltimore Orioles in 2006. On the trading deadline of 1999, Rigoberto Beltran would be dealt to the Dodgers in exchange for Darrell Hamilton, who would be waived 2 seasons later, and Chuck McElroy. Chuck McElroy would be dealt to the Orioles on December 10, 1999 in exchange for Jesse Orosco from the 86 Mets. And Orosco would be dealt to the Cardinals on March 18, 2000 in exchange for Joe McEwing, who would be released 5 years later. On December 23, 1999, Roger Cedeno would be dealt to the Houston Astros in exchange for Mike Hampton and Derek Bell. Mike Hampton would leave in free agency for the Colorado Rockies, and in compensation was Aaron Haleman and David Wright. Aaron Haleman would be dealt in a 3-team deal with the Indians and Mariners in exchange for J.J. Putz, Sean Green, and Jeremy Reed. Ray Knight, who ended up scoring the game-winning run in Game 6, would leave in free agency after being the World Series MVP to join the Baltimore Orioles. What was left for compensation was the 39th overall pick, in which the New York Mets selected Todd Hundley ahead of Albert Belly and even Derek Bell. Hundley was included in a deal that I have mentioned previously, so I'll go over that again real quickly. Hundley was dealt along with Gooch in exchange for Roger Cedeno and Charles Johnson. Cedeno was dealt with Dotel and Kessel in exchange for 2000 NLCS MVP Mike Hampton and Derek Bell. Derek Bell left in free agency, no compensation awarded. Mike Hampton left. The Mets were awarded 2 compensation picks. Aaron Haleman and David Wright were the selections. Haleman was dealt in a 3-team deal with the Indians and Mariners, and the Mets got in return J.J. Putz, Sean Green, and Jeremy Reed. All three would lead the team by 2010. Charles Johnson would be dealt to the Baltimore Orioles in '98 in exchange for Armando Benitez, and then Benitez would be dealt to the Yankees in 2003 in exchange for Jason Anderson, who was waived in 2004, would go on to the Indians. Ryan Bacodoa and Anderson Garcia, who was lost to the waivers to the Baltimore Orioles in 2006. Ed Herndon would be dealt with Rick Anderson and Mauro Gazzo to the Kansas City Royals on March 27, 1987 in exchange for David Kahn and Chris Jellick, who would be released by the New York Mets in 1990. David Cohn would be dealt to the Toronto Blue Jays on August 27, 1992 in exchange for Jeff Kent and a player to be named later, Ryan Thompson. Jeff Kent would be dealt to the Cleveland Indians on July 2, 1996 in exchange for Carlos Baerga, who would be granted free agency 2 seasons later, signed with the Cardinals, and Alvaro Espinoza, who was released by the Mets a season later. Ryan Thompson would be dealt to the Indians on March 31, 1996 for Mark Clark. Mark Clark would be dealt to the Chicago Cubs on August 8, 1997 in exchange for Turk Weldon, Brian McRae, and Mel Royals Sr. Turk Weldon would be dealt to the Philadelphia Phillies on July 27, 2001 in exchange for Bruce Chen and Adam Walker, who would not be re-signed after 2003. I don't know what happened to him. Bruce Chen would be dealt to the Expos on April 5, 2002 in exchange for Scott Strickland, released from the AAA Mets in 2005, Phil Siebel, who would be lost off waivers to the Boston Red Sox in 2003, and Matt Watson, lost off waivers to the Oakland Athletics in 2003. Brian McRae would be dealt to the Los Angeles Dodgers on trade deadline 1999 in exchange for Darrell Hamilton, who would be waived 2 seasons later, and Chuck McElroy. Chuck McElroy would be dealt to the Baltimore Orioles in exchange for Jesse Orosco, who was on the '86 Mets. Orosco would be dealt to the Cardinals in 2000 for Joe McEwing. He would be released in 2005. And Mel Royals Sr. on 11/11/98 would be dealt to the Los Angeles Dodgers in exchange for Bobby Bonilla, $1.19 million a year. Doug Sisk would be dealt to the Baltimore Orioles on December 9, 1987 in exchange for Blaine Beatty. Beatty would be dealt to the Montreal Expos on December 9, 1991 in exchange for Jeff Barry. Jeff Barry would be dealt to the San Diego Padres on December 15, 1995 in exchange for Pedro Martinez. Not that one. He would be waived and claimed by the Reds on September 13, 1996, the same day Playboy Cardi was born. Jesse Orosco, who I've already mentioned twice in the video, here's how he was dealt away in a 3-team deal with the Athletics and Dodgers. Oddly enough, the other 2 teams would be in the World Series the next year. Orosco holds the MLB record for 1,252 games pitched. The package included Kevin Tapani, Wally Whitehurst, and Jack Savage. Tapani would be included in a deal with Jack Savage on trade deadline 1989 in exchange for Frank Viola to the Minnesota Twins. He would later be granted free agency in 1991, signed with the Boston Red Sox. The 2 compensation draft picks were Chris Roberts and John Ward. Roberts would be traded to the Oakland Athletics in 1998 for cash or something. I wasn't able to find whatever the package deal was. And John Ward did not sign, and for some reason, I guess there wasn't that compensation pick you get when you aren't able to sign a player. Oh well. Wally Whitehurst was dealt to the San Diego Padres on 10/26/1992 in exchange for Tony Fernandez. Tony Fernandez would be dealt to the Toronto Blue Jays on 6/11/93 in exchange for Darcin Jackson. Be granted free agency at the end of the season. He signed with the Chicago White Sox. Rafael Santana was able to take the subway to his new home at Yankee Stadium on December 11, 1987, when he was dealt to the Yankees for Darren Reed, Phil Lombardi, who was lost off waivers to the Atlanta Braves on 4/6/1990, and Steve Frey. Darren Reed would be dealt to the Montreal Expos on April 2, 1991, in exchange for Terrell Hansen, who was somehow back on the Expos in 1993, not sure how, and David Sommer, who stopped playing baseball after 1991. Steve Frey would also be dealt to the Expos on March 28, 1989 in exchange for Mark Bailey, who would later sign with the Giants to play the next season, and Tom O'Malley, who after 1990 signed with the Japanese team, the Hampton Tigers. The current manager of the New Britain Bees, Wally Backman, would be dealt to the Minnesota Twins on December 7, 1988 in exchange for Jeff Baumgartner, zero relation to the Giants pitcher, Steve Gasser, and Toby Nevins. Somehow, two of these players stopped playing for the team in 1990, and one of them just ultimately retired after 1991. On June 18, 1989, Lenny Dykstra would be dealt with Roger McDowell to the Philadelphia Phillies in exchange for Juan Samuel. Juan Samuel would be dealt to the Dodgers in exchange for Mike Marshall and Alejandro Pena. Mike Marshall would be dealt to the Boston Red Sox the next season in exchange for Greg Hansel and their Peroza, who somehow ended up back in Boston in 1993, don't know how. And a minor league player to be named later, Paul Williams, who ended up back in Baltimore in 1992, not sure how. Greg Hansel would be dealt to the Los Angeles Dodgers for Hubie Brooks. Hubie Brooks would be dealt to the Angels in exchange for Dave Gallagher. Dave Gallagher would be dealt to the Atlanta Braves in exchange for Pete Smith, who would sign back with the Braves in 1994. Alejandro Pena would be dealt to the Braves in exchange for Tony Castillo and a player to be named later, Joe Roa. Tony Castillo would be dealt to the Tigers in exchange for Randy Marshall, who somehow returned to the Tigers in 1995, and Paul Gibson, who would be released by the Mets in 1993. Joe Roa would be dealt to the Cleveland Indians in exchange for Paul Bird, who would be traded to the Braves in 1996, Jerry DePito, who would be traded to the Rockies in 1996, Dave Millick, who would be dealt to the Dodgers in 1998, and a player to be named later, Jesus Azuji, who ended up in Cleveland in 1999, not sure how. Paul Bird would be dealt to the Atlanta Braves in exchange for Greg McMichael. Jerry DePito would be dealt to the Colorado Rockies in exchange for Armando Reynoso, who would sign with the Diamondbacks in 1998, the season after they first started. The MLB awarded the Mets with one draft pick compensation, the 84th overall selection that they would use on Jake Joseph, who played 0 MLB games, stopped playing after 2005. Dave Mlikai would be dealt to the Los Angeles Dodgers in exchange for Hideo Nomo, who was lost in free agency to the Chicago Cubs the next season, and Brad Klontz, who would be lost in free agency to the Boston Red Sox. Mookie Wilson came up clutch against the Red Sox in Game 6, bottom 10, but it did help that, Bill Buckner was like a defensive liability at that point. July 31st, 1989 would be dealt to the Toronto Blue Jays in exchange for Jeff Musselman, who the team declined his tender contract after the 1990 season, and Mike Brady, who somehow, someway ended up on the Milwaukee Brewers in 1991. On the same day, Lee Mazzoli would be waived and later claimed by the Toronto Blue Jays. Rick Aguilar was included in the deal that I mentioned earlier with Sapani and Savage to the Minnesota Twins in exchange for Frank Viola. Frank Viola left the New York Mets after 1990, signed with the Boston Red Sox, and the Mets would be awarded 2 compensation draft picks, the 18th overall selection and Chris Roberts, who would be dealt to the Oakland Athletics in exchange for cash in 1998, and John Ward, who did not sign, and the MLB did not award the Mets a compensation draft pick for him not signing, whatever sense that makes or doesn't make. On November 13th, 1989, Keith Hernandez was granted free agency. He would later sign with the Cleveland Indians. On November 14th, 1989, Gary Carter would be released, would later sign with the San Francisco Giants. After the 1990 MLB season, Darryl Strawberry was granted free agency. He would later sign with the Los Angeles Dodgers. The MLB awarded the Mets with 2 compensation draft picks, the 18th overall selection, Al Shirley, who somehow ended up in Kansas City in 1996, not sure how, tried to do the research, couldn't find anything, and the 36th overall selection, Bobby Jones, who would later be granted free agency in 2000, signed with the San Diego Padres. The Bobby Jones compensation was the 76th selection, Corey Ragsdale, who somehow ended up with the Texas Rangers in 2008, not sure how. Bob Ojeda would be included in a deal that I mentioned earlier with Greg Hansel to the Dodgers in exchange for Hubie Brooks. Hubie Brooks would be dealt to the Angels in exchange for Dave Gallagher. Gallagher would be dealt to the Atlanta Braves in exchange for Pete Smith. How could you forget the Tuffle Shuffle? Well, apparently the Mets did, because they dealt him to the San Diego Padres on May 31st, 1991 in exchange for Gary Templeman, who would be granted free agency on November 4th, 1991, and never played in the MLB again. Ron Darling would be dealt to the Montreal Expos on July 15th, 1991, in exchange for Tim Burke. Tim Burke would be dealt to the New York Yankees on June 9th, 1992, in exchange for Lee Gutterman, who would be granted free agency on October 30th, 1992, and would sign with the Los Angeles Dodgers. After the 1992 MLB season, Kevin Elster would be granted free agency and would later sign with the Los Angeles Dodgers. Howard Johnson would be granted free agency after the 1993 MLB season. He would later sign with the Colorado Rockies. As compensation awarded by the MLB, the Mets had the 98th overall selection in the 94 draft to select Kenny Pumphrey, who would later be claimed in a Rule 5 draft from the Minnesota Twins on December 13, 1999. The New York Mets. After the conclusion of the 1993 MLB season, Sid Fernandez would sign with the Baltimore Orioles. The MLB awarded the Mets with 2 compensation draft picks in the 94 draft, the 20th selection being Terrence Long, the 29th selection being Jay Payton. Terrence Long would be dealt to the Oakland Athletics in 1999 in exchange for Kenny Rogers, who would be lost in free agency to the Rangers on December 29, 1999. Jay Payton would be dealt to the Colorado Rockies on trade deadline 2002 in exchange for Mark Little and John Thompson. Mark Little would be dealt to the Diamondbacks a few weeks later in exchange for a player to be named later, P.J. Beavis, who would sign with the Colorado Rockies in 2005. Dwight Gooden stopped pitching for the New York Mets in 1994, took a year off baseball and signed with the Yankees in 1996, threw a no-hitter for them and won the World Series that same season, and somehow ended up back on the Yankees in 2000 and won another ring. Alright, this is the part of the video with any extra notes that I had written down where I didn't feel like overloading the video with. So everything that I have said about transactions, it's all done. This is just like notes that I have written on specific players that I wanted to not leave out. Kevin Mitchell would end up winning the 1989 National League MVP and made it to the World Series with the Giants and made a barehanded catch. Ray Knight coached 2 seasons as a manager for the Cincinnati Reds, replaced Davey Johnson, oddly enough, and is now a national studio analyst. Ed Hearn has a Bottom of the Ninth Foundation, which is a mentorship program, has an autobiography, and is the only player to win a championship in A level, AA, AAA, and the MLB 4 seasons in a row. Jesse Orosco only had 4 errors in 1,295 innings pitched and is the last player to play in the MLB from the 1970s and the last player from the 86 Mets to pitch in a game. Rafael Santana is the Dominican Republic scouting player development for the Chicago White Sox. Roger McDowell is the pitching coach for the Atlanta Braves from 2006 to 2016 and the Orioles from 17 on. Lenny Dykstra wrote an autobiography, House of Nails. Lee Mazzoli is the coach for the Yankees for 2000 to 2003, won a World Series, was the Orioles manager in 04-05, and went back to the Yankees as a coach in 06. And had his son Lee Jr. drafted in the 4th round by the Mets in 2013. He would be dealt to the Yankees this year. Rick Aguilar ended up winning the 91 World Series with the Minnesota Twins after the trade and is in the Twins Hall of Fame. Keith Hernandez is a color commentator for the New York Mets for SNY. Darryl Strasburg won 3 World Series with the New York Yankees from 96 to 99. Ron Darling ended up getting mentioned in an episode of Law & Order Season 13, episode Under God, and he played himself in Mr. 3000. Pause. Evan Helster ended up playing Pat Corning in Little Big League, the movie from 1994 where the kid basically inherits the Minnesota Twins and becomes the manager. Howard Johnson, his son Glenn, was drafted in the 36th round by the Mets in 2007 but did not sign. So that's all I have for you guys today. If you liked the video, if you learned anything new, if you could please like, comment, subscribe. And until next time, peace out.